Have you ever had that feeling? Something about what someone is saying just doesn't feel right. Their words sound believable. Their story seems to make sense. But somewhere in the back of your mind, something is telling you something is off. Maybe it's the way they answered. Maybe they suddenly became more careful with their words. Maybe they avoided a question. Or maybe you can't explain it at all. You just feel like you're not getting the whole truth. And here's the uncomfortable reality. People lie. Sometimes to protect someone. Sometimes to avoid consequences. Sometimes because they're afraid of what the truth will cost them. And sometimes because they want to manipulate a situation for their own benefit. That means knowing how to recognize potential deception isn't just an interesting psychological skill. It can be a form of self-protection. But there's one important thing to understand before we begin. There is no single gesture, facial expression, or sentence that can prove someone is lying. Someone looking away doesn't automatically mean they're lying. Someone touching their face doesn't automatically mean they're lying. Someone hesitating doesn't automatically mean they're lying. Human behavior is complicated. The real skill is learning to notice patterns, changes, inconsistencies, and clusters of signals. And once you understand that, you can start paying attention to something most people completely ignore. Not just what someone says, but how they behave when they're saying it. So let's start with the first technique. Ask better questions. Most people ask questions that make lying incredibly easy. They ask something broad like, "So, how did last night go?" That's a terrible question if you're trying to understand what actually happened. It's too open. The person can give you a vague answer, skip uncomfortable details, and control the entire direction of the conversation. They might say, "It was fine," and technically they answered you, but you learned almost nothing. A better approach is to ask questions that encourage the person to explain something specific. Instead of, "Did you get home late?" you could ask, "What kept you out so late last night?" Now the person has to construct an explanation. You're not accusing them. You're simply giving them space to tell you what happened. And that's important, because when someone is telling the truth, they generally have a real sequence of events to describe. When someone is inventing a story, they're constructing that sequence in real time. The more detail they have to manage, the more opportunities there are for inconsistencies. But don't turn this into an interrogation. Your goal isn't to make someone feel trapped. It's to create a calm conversation where you can observe how naturally their story develops. Because pressure can create strange behavior even in innocent people. Which brings us to the next principle. Don't look for one sign. Look for clusters. Imagine you ask someone a question. They pause for a moment. Is that proof they're lying? No. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they misunderstood the question. Maybe they're simply choosing their words carefully. One signal means very little. But imagine something different happens. You ask the question, they pause. Their tone changes. They suddenly become vague. They avoid the specific part of your question. Then they change the subject. Now you have something more interesting. You're not looking at one behavior. You're looking at a cluster of behaviors occurring around the same moment. One unusual behavior can be normal. Several unusual behaviors appearing together can be worth investigating. And this leads to one of the most important concepts in detecting deception, the baseline. Before you can recognize unusual behavior, you have to know what normal behavior looks like. Think about someone you know well. You probably know how they normally speak, how quickly they answer questions, how much eye contact they naturally make, how they sit, how they move their hands, whether they talk quickly or slowly, whether they joke when they're nervous, whether they pause before answering difficult questions. That is their baseline. And the closer you know someone, the easier it becomes to recognize when something changes. Imagine someone who normally talks rapidly and confidently. You ask them a completely ordinary question, and they answer immediately. Everything is normal. Then you bring up a particular subject. Suddenly their speech becomes slower. They start choosing their words carefully. They stop making eye contact. Their posture changes. They begin using phrases like, "I think," "maybe," "as far as I remember," "I guess," something like that. Again, none of those things proves deception, but the change from their normal behavior is worth noticing. That's the real principle. Don't ask, "Does this behavior mean they're lying?" Ask, "Why did their behavior suddenly change?" That question is much more useful. Now let's talk about another powerful technique. Ask about the same event more than once, not aggressively, not like you're testing them. Just approach the event from different angles. For example, you might ask, "Did you go to the gym yesterday?" They say yes. A few minutes later, you casually ask, "What workout did you do?" Now you're not asking exactly the same question. You're asking about another part of the same memory. Someone telling the truth may naturally remember additional details. Someone inventing a story has to maintain consistency between multiple answers. And that's where problems can appear. Maybe they originally said they arrived at 7. Later they say they left at 7. Maybe they said they were with one person. Later they casually mention another person who was supposedly there. Maybe the sequence of events suddenly doesn't make sense. The important thing isn't to immediately declare, "You're lying." Instead, notice the inconsistency. Then ask for clarification, because sometimes people simply remember things incorrectly. Memory isn't a perfect recording. That's why deception detection requires patience. You're collecting information. You're not delivering a verdict. Another thing to watch closely is language. When people are uncertain, nervous, or trying to avoid making a definite statement, their language can become less precise. You may hear, "I think," "maybe," "probably," "as far as I remember," "I guess," something like that. These phrases aren't proof of lying. Some people naturally speak this way. Others become vague when they're nervous. But if someone normally speaks very confidently and suddenly becomes unusually careful and vague when discussing one particular subject, that's something worth paying attention to, especially when it appears alongside other changes. And sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what someone says, it's what they refuse to talk about. Topic switching. You ask a direct question. Instead of answering, they suddenly talk about something else. You ask again. They give you another unrelated explanation. "Why are you asking me that? Why don't you trust me? Where is this coming from?" Sometimes those responses are completely understandable. Nobody enjoys feeling accused. But sometimes changing the subject is a way of avoiding the subject. And there's an important distinction here. Someone who feels falsely accused may become defensive, but still answer your question. Someone avoiding the question may repeatedly redirect the conversation without ever actually answering it. That's the pattern you want to notice. Now here's something even more interesting. Interrupt the story. "Why are you asking me that? Why don't you trust me? Where is this coming from?" Sometimes those responses are completely understandable. Nobody enjoys feeling accused. But sometimes changing the subject is a way of avoiding the subject. And there's an important distinction here. Someone who feels falsely accused may become defensive, but still answer your question. Someone avoiding the question may repeatedly redirect the conversation without ever actually answering it. That's the pattern you want to notice. Now here's something even more interesting. Lying can require a significant amount of mental effort. A person may have to remember what they already said, construct new details, keep the timeline consistent, and avoid contradicting themselves. So if someone is telling you a complicated story, you can occasionally interrupt naturally. For example, "Wait, what happened right before that?" Then, "Okay, sorry, continue." You aren't trying to confuse them, you're simply changing the direction of the conversation. And now observe how easily they return to the original narrative. Do they continue naturally? Do they suddenly forget important details? Do they restart the story? Do certain details change? Does the sequence become confusing? Again, one mistake proves nothing, but repeated inconsistencies can become meaningful. Because the goal isn't to catch someone making one mistake. The goal is to determine whether their entire story remains coherent. There's another technique that involves something called a false detail. Imagine someone tells you about an event. You casually say, "You said it happened on Tuesday, right? But wasn't that the day the store was closed?" You intentionally introduce a detail that may be incorrect. Someone who actually remembers the event might immediately correct you. "No, it wasn't Tuesday, it was Wednesday." That correction is completely natural. Someone who is protecting a fabricated story may sometimes be more hesitant to challenge your statement because they don't want to create another contradiction. But again, be careful. This is not a magical lie detector. People can misunderstand you. They can become confused. They can have poor memories. They can simply assume you're correct. Think of every technique as another piece of information. And one of the most useful pieces of information is time. Ask about the timeline. What time did you leave? What time did you arrive? What happened before that? How long were you there? Who was with you when you arrived? Time creates structure, and fabricated stories can sometimes struggle under structure. Imagine someone says, "I left around 8, drove there, stayed for about 30 minutes, and got home around 8:30. That timeline may immediately raise questions, depending on the distance involved. Or someone may give different times every time you revisit the story. Interesting. Again, that doesn't automatically mean they're lying. People are bad at remembering exact times. But if the timeline repeatedly contradicts itself, that's worth noticing. And now we get to one of the most important principles of all. Pay attention to what happens immediately after the question. When you ask someone something important, don't immediately start talking again. Let the silence exist. People often feel uncomfortable with silence, so they rush to fill it. And sometimes what they say after their initial answer can reveal more than the answer itself. Maybe they suddenly start over-explaining. Maybe they give you information you never asked for. Maybe they repeat the same statement several times. I swear, honestly, I'm telling you the truth. I would never do that. Sometimes genuine people say these things too, but excessive reassurance can be worth noticing when it appears alongside other suspicious behavior. The mistake is becoming obsessed with individual tells. The real skill is learning to observe deviations from normal behavior. And this is where knowing someone well becomes extremely valuable. Because deception doesn't necessarily look the same for everyone. One person becomes quiet, another becomes overly talkative. One person avoids eye contact, another stares too intensely because they're consciously trying to appear honest. One person becomes defensive, another becomes unusually calm. That's why there is no universal body language dictionary that says, looking left means lying, touching your nose means lying, crossing your arms means lying. Human behavior doesn't work that neatly. Context matters, personality matters, culture matters, stress matters, the situation matters, and your relationship with the person matters. Which brings us to something even deeper. Sometimes your intuition notices something before your conscious mind can explain it. You walk away from a conversation thinking, I don't know what it was, but something felt wrong. That feeling shouldn't automatically be treated as proof, but it shouldn't necessarily be ignored either. Your brain is constantly processing patterns, tone, timing, facial expressions, word choice, previous experiences, behavioral changes. You may consciously notice none of these things, while your brain notices all of them. That's why intuition can sometimes feel mysterious. But intuition isn't the same thing as certainty. Treat it as a signal to pay closer attention, not as a final verdict. And there's another reason this matters. Because the people who are easiest to deceive are often the people who desperately want to believe the story they're being told. They don't want to discover the truth. They want reassurance. They want the relationship to be okay. They want the employee to be trustworthy. They want the friend to be loyal. And because they want it so badly, they ignore inconsistencies. They explain everything away. They see one suspicious behavior and immediately create an innocent explanation for it. This is where emotional attachment can interfere with perception. If you desperately want someone to be honest, you may become blind to evidence that they're not. But there's an equally dangerous mistake on the opposite side, becoming so suspicious that you see deception everywhere. If you assume everyone is lying, you'll eventually destroy perfectly healthy relationships. You'll interpret nervousness as guilt, forgetfulness as deception, a bad mood as manipulation, a distracted answer as dishonesty. That's not awareness, that's paranoia. The goal isn't to become someone who suspects everyone. The goal is to become someone who observes carefully without jumping to conclusions. That's a completely different mindset. You don't need to interrogate everyone around you. You don't need to test your partner. You don't need to secretly analyze every movement someone makes. You simply need to become more attentive. Listen to the words, watch the behavior, understand the baseline, notice changes, look for clusters, ask follow-up questions, check the timeline, pay attention to contradictions, and most importantly, give people enough room to reveal themselves naturally. Because sometimes the best way to discover the truth isn't to force it out of someone. It's simply to stop interrupting the story. Let them talk. Let them explain. Let them continue. People often reveal more when they don't feel like they're being cornered. And if their story is true, it will generally have a structure. It may contain mistakes. It may contain forgotten details. But there is usually an underlying reality connecting those details. A fabricated story has to be maintained, and the longer it continues, the more difficult that maintenance can become. That's why consistency matters so much. Not perfection, consistency. And there's one final principle you should remember. The goal of learning about deception isn't to become better at catching people. It's to become better at protecting yourself. Because sometimes the biggest lie isn't the lie someone tells you. It's the lie you tell yourself afterward. I'll ignore it. It probably doesn't matter. I'm probably imagining things. I don't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe you're right. Maybe everything is completely innocent. But if something repeatedly doesn't make sense, you don't have to accuse anyone. You can simply pay attention. You can ask questions. You can create boundaries. You can wait for more information. And if someone consistently shows you that their words and actions don't match, you don't need a confession to protect yourself. Because ultimately, the most powerful form of lie detection isn't being able to say, "I caught you." It's being able to recognize, "This situation doesn't feel trustworthy, and I don't need to stay vulnerable to it." That's the real skill. Not suspicion, not paranoia, not manipulation. Awareness. Because the world is full of people who will tell you exactly what you want to hear. And sometimes, the difference between being fooled and protecting yourself isn't some secret FBI trick. It's simply being willing to slow down, listen carefully, notice what changes, and pay attention when someone's story doesn't match their behavior. The truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, you have to be quiet enough to notice it.